Are you a citizen or current resident in the United States? If so, how would you answer this question? Are you loyal to the United States? For some of you, the answer may be a resounding yes. You're loyal to the US because you believe in its democratic ideals, because the US is where you call home. For others, the answer may be a definite no. You don't consider yourself loyal to the US because you don't support the current administration, or perhaps home is elsewhere, outside of the US. For the rest of us, the answer may be a mix of yes and no. Perhaps you consider the US your home, but you don't support the current administration. Perhaps you believe in the US's democratic ideals, but you resent its colonial past. Perhaps you take issue with the wording of the question. What does it mean to be loyal to a government? How does one show their loyalty to a country? And can you be loyal and critical at the same time? Are you loyal to the United States? This painful, difficult, and existential question was what Japanese American incarcerees were faced with while they were imprisoned during World War II. Many of us may have learned that following the Pearl Harbor attacks on December 7th of 1941, President Franklin D. Roosevelt issued an executive order that set into motion the forced removal and incarceration of over 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry into so-called internment camps. But many of us, in fact, actually few of us, may be aware that a year after the executive order was issued, the War Department decided to recruit young Japanese Americans from the camps into the military, yes, to fight the Japanese. And they distributed a questionnaire to help them determine which incarcerees were loyal to the US government and therefore eligible for military recruitment. This questionnaire later became known as the Loyalty Questionnaire because it included two controversial questions that helped the War Department identify which incarcerees were loyal or disloyal to the US government. The questions were, are you willing to serve in the armed forces of the United States on combat duty wherever ordered? And will you swear unqualified allegiance to the United States of America and faithfully defend the United States from any or all attack by foreign or domestic forces? And here's the important part. Forswear any allegiance or obedience to the Japanese emperor or any other foreign government, power, or organization. These questions, especially the last question, caused a lot of confusion amongst the camp population. For example, if you were a US-born citizen, which mind you, 2/3 of the camp population was at this time, forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor would connote that you had an allegiance to the Japanese emperor to begin with. So some feared that answering yes to this question could criminalize them as potential saboteurs. On the other hand, if you were not born in the US, forswearing allegiance to the Japanese emperor could mean giving up your statehood, since foreign-born aliens were unable to naturalize into American citizens yet at this time. So some feared that answering yes to this question could render them stateless refugees. For many incarcerees, these questions, they frankly felt like a slap in the face, delivered to them a year after they had been displaced from their homes and held captive in these remote camps across the US. Some incarcerees, they answered no to these questions strictly on moral grounds, to protest the stark violation of their constitutional rights. Unfortunately, those who answered no or refused to answer these two questions were deemed disloyal. They were dubbed no-nos and sent to a maximum security camp called Tule Lake in Northern California, often separated from their friends and family. In total, there were about 12,000 no-nos who were sent to Tule Lake. Many were stigmatized by the general public and even members of their own community for being traitors to the US. I am a first-generation immigrant from Japan who came to the US as a toddler. I have no family ties to the camps. Until recently, my knowledge of the camps was limited to what I'd read in history textbooks, that Japanese Americans were displaced from their homes and incarcerated in camps during the war. I learned that despite this grave injustice, Japanese Americans had responded with silent vigilance. I learned that instead of protesting the indignities of camp life, they had built gardens, they had formed baseball teams, and they had continued their education in shoddy barrack classrooms. I learned that rather than talking about their incarceration, Japanese Americans, they remained silent about the incarceration to forget and move on past the stark chapter in their family histories. But after learning about the loyalty questionnaire, I began to wonder if the history textbooks captured the entire story. I began asking Japanese Americans for their accounts of what happened during the war. And you know what they taught me? They taught me that the camp population was far from silent. In fact, there were fervent no-no dissenters, as much as there were brazen servicemen who fought and died for the US. They taught me that incarcerees, they formed baseball teams and beautified their surroundings, not from a place of compliance, but to protect their children from the shame and humiliation of growing up in a desolate camp. They taught me that far from wanting to forget about their family histories, hundreds of Japanese American families have been revisiting their camps in the form of pilgrimages since the late 1960s in order to remember and honor their ancestors. Growing up, the story of Japanese American incarceration was presented to me as a historical event that forced my community into silence. But I soon learned that the story of Japanese American incarceration is not a story of Japanese American victimhood, but a quintessentially American story of survival and belonging, and the silent choices we make to forge a life here in this country, to call this country home. This was the impetus for my project, Kyampu, an American Story, which is an educational website that features portraits of survivors and descendants of Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. Over the past 2 years, and with the support of National Geographic Society, I have been joining these families as they embark on pilgrimages and asking them to reflect on their family histories. Here's a trailer featuring Gregory and Midori Sampson, whom I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage back to Tule Lake, where Gregory's mother was incarcerated.
I was raised that this is a period of my family's life that we want to forget. Our family is like we never really talked about a lot of stuff, personal stuff. I never knew my parents' birthday, or I never knew anything about their history. I didn't even know how I fit in the family dynamic. All of my siblings all have this tendency to have secrets. And I think that's a lot of what my mom learned, to repress a lot of ideas or attitudes because it's going to get you in trouble. When we named our daughter Midori, my mom had a fit, just went on for a couple months about how this was going to be nothing but trouble for us with her name being Japanese, and why would you do that to her? And so, yeah, there's that feeling in there of that this could happen again.
As Gregory shared, many Japanese American families did not talk about their incarceration after the war. And while this silence is often interpreted as avoidance or emotional incompetence, or perhaps a cultural tendency not to disclose your inner struggles, Gregory shared with me that his mother likely did not talk about her incarceration in order to protect her children and grandchildren from the shame and discrimination that she had experienced. So instead of asking families to divulge these unspoken narratives and to break this gentle and protective silence, I have been asking survivors and descendants to handwrite a letter. For survivors, a letter to their child self when they were incarcerated, and for descendants, a letter to the survivor and their family. The family you're seeing here is the Ideno family, whom I had the privilege of joining on a pilgrimage back to Rower, a camp in southeastern Arkansas. Sitting here in the middle is survivor Kazuo Ideno, with his daughter Karen on the right and his grandchildren Jacqueline and Blake on the left. Survivor Kazuo Ideno, he dedicated his letter to his 2.5-year-old self when he and his family were displaced from their home in San Francisco and first arrived in Rower.
Dear young Kaz, you are not responsible for Japan starting World War II against the United States. Unfortunately, because you were only 2.5 years old when you were incarcerated, you developed a sense of guilt and shame during your formative years after leaving camp. You spent many years trying to prove you were a patriotic American, such as refusing to take Japanese language classes and legally adding an American first name when you turned 15. It took years for you to realize your Japanese American culture has always been an important part of who you are. The influence of your parents still carries on in you, as well as the responsibility to pass on Japanese American culture to your children and grandchildren. Love, Kaz.
And this is his daughter Karen, who dedicated her letter to her father.
Dad, I can see the scars on your skin of the burns from the potbelly stove, a result of being a toddler in cramped quarters. The deeper scars of inferiority and shame are hidden inside your heart and mind. Shadows of those scars have been passed through the generations as we continue to endure prejudice and racism. How devastating it must have been for your family to lose everything: the home, the business, your freedom. How tremendously stressful it must have been for Grandma to face incarceration alone as a single mom, since the FBI had taken Grandpa to prison immediately for being a community leader. How embarrassed Grandma must have been every day to use the open communal bathrooms and showers that had been deliberately designed to humiliate. How terrified you must have been when you learn that your dad had almost died after being stabbed in the back by a drunk guard. My heart cries when I think about this painful chapter you survived. You and Grandma were born here. 2 generations of Americans, yet somehow not considered American enough due to racial prejudice. It is our duty to make sure the legacy lives on through the generations, and this travesty never happens again. Love, Karen.
These portraits are compiled into family profiles where readers can learn about one family's history from multi-generational perspectives. These family profiles include the photos and the audio that we had just experienced together, as well as some contextual information about each individual and how they've interpreted their family histories. So far, I have had the privilege of photographing over 60 individuals across 30 families. These portraits are showcased on the Campu website, which is meant to serve as an educational resource for secondary school teachers to use when they're teaching this segment of U.S. history. The Campu website is currently in progress, but set to launch next year on Day of Remembrance. That's February 19th of 2025, in time for the 80th year anniversary of the end of World War II. Now, traditional storytelling can be extractional at times, the success of which is often measured by the amount of information that we can draw from an individual. But as these Japanese American families have taught me, sometimes the true story lies in the gardens that we diligently build, the decisions that we quietly make, and the silence between generations. I stand on the backs of many prolific journalists and storytellers, many of whom I share the room with here today, that have challenged the ethics of traditional storytelling, who have paved the way for less traditional projects like Campu to reach a broad audience. As a storyteller, I hope to continue this legacy, to honor not only the stories that are being told, but also, if not especially, the stories that are held a little closer to the heart, the stories that lie beneath this gentle and protective silence. Thank you.